Well, good afternoon, officially, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this Friday at the Michigan Opioid Collaborative Substance Use During Adolescence, an overview of trends, risk factors, and consequences with Dr. Megan Martz. We are just so glad for all of you to be with us today. We have a lot of content, a lot of great things to cover today, and so we're just going to go ahead and jump right in at noon. Just a few housekeeping items. Just make sure that you're muted throughout the presentation unless you have a question. We would love for you to use the chat function or use the raise hand function. Myself and my colleague Melissa DeMars will be moderating today and helping in getting those questions to Dr. Martz throughout the presentation. And then we'll have time at the end for a Q&A. Also, just a reminder to please put your name, your email, and your location in the chat. That way we kind of know who's here and that we can follow up with some materials from after our presentation today and make sure that you get a copy of all of that good stuff as well. So quickly before we move on to introduction with Dr. Martz, I'd like to share just a bit about the Michigan Opioid Collaborative, what we are and what we do. This brief overview is to share some of the things that the Michigan Opioid Collaborative can offer. We would love for you to check out our website, which we will put in the chat as well, for you to click and toggle through some of our wonderful events that are coming up. Also, look at our resources. We have wonderful toolkits as well on our website as well. I wanted to highlight our same-day consultation services. This is for providers around the state to have phone consultations with a team of addiction specialists with the Michigan Opioid Collaborative Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. And your BHC can help get you connected with them and have that free service available to you. We also have our educational webinars, such as the one today. We're so glad that you're here, and we hope that you continue to register and join us for webinars in the future. We also offer hepatitis C support with our wonderful Hep C provider within the MOC, and the information for that is also found on our website. In addition to that, your behavioral health consultant will be reaching out to you. We have 6 stationed around the state, and we will make sure that you get all the information that you need from us. My name is Megan Collette. I am the behavioral health consultant for the Western region of Michigan. I'm joined by my colleague, Melissa DeMars, the BHC for the Upper Peninsula, and Katrina Hernandez, the BHC for our Central region as well. We are so glad and grateful that you have joined us today. Dr. Megan Martz is an assistant professor in psychiatry at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on identifying psychosocial and neuro factors associated with substance use in adolescents and young adults. Dr. Martz received her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Michigan and completed postdoctoral training at the Michigan Medicine Addiction Center. Prior to her doctoral work, Dr. Martz received her MSW degree from the University of Chicago and completed clinical internships in community and hospital settings. It's also noted there are no financial disclosures in this presentation with Dr. Martz today. So with that, I would love to turn it over to you. We're very grateful for your time and your information today, and very excited to have you here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here today. It sounds like a really amazing group of providers and community members, etc. So, and something I've been trying to do more of is connecting with clinicians and the community to give outreach. I think it's so important to share what we're finding to those people. Okay, so getting started today, I just want to give an overview of what I'll be discussing. So first, I'll be describing unique aspects of adolescence as a developmental period when substance use experimentation and onset occur. Then I'm going to present current trends in substance use behavior among the most commonly used substances, which are alcohol, nicotine, and cannabis. But because this webinar is for the Michigan Opioid Collaborative, I'll also be talking a little bit about opioid use in teens. Then I'm going to provide an overview of risk factors for adolescent substance use and conclude by presenting findings on consequences of adolescent substance use. So as Megan said, my PhD is in developmental psychology. So I think it's important to take a developmental perspective in understanding why adolescents use substances. I was originally interested in adolescent health, and I realized that substance use is a big contributor to health problems in adolescence, so which led me to my research I'm doing now. So first, I'm going to talk about substance use in the context of adolescent development. So adolescence is a developmental period that begins in early adolescence, followed by middle and then late adolescence. So it's helpful to think about them in these separate kind of chunks of time. So in early adolescence, puberty typically begins, which heightens emotional arousability and increases sensation seeking and reward-driven behaviors. Then in middle adolescence, vulnerability for risk-taking and difficulty regulating emotions and behaviors tends to occur. Also during this time, there's often a shift in increasing importance of peers compared to parents. And this is important because risk-taking is more likely to occur in the presence of peers. There's been some really interesting studies, even in the animal literature, showing that juvenile mice are more likely to engage in risk-taking behavior in adolescence. And then late adolescence is when many social transitions occur, such as leaving the home, starting college or work, and forming more serious romantic partnerships. This time also coincides with continued maturation of frontal brain regions involved in self-regulation and cognitive control. So I want to hone in a bit more on brain development occurring during adolescence and even into young adulthood, as this is a focal area of my research. In adolescence, gray matter thins through synaptic pruning and myelinated white matter increases, which makes brain connections more specialized and efficient. But this process takes quite a bit of time, as you can see in this figure showing brain maturation from age 5 to 20. So the teen brain can be thought of like a computer program that's still being coded. And this makes it more vulnerable to drug use. And here's another way to show adolescent brain development, focusing on the developmental mismatch between cognitive control and socio-emotional reward systems, with the cognitive control system here shown in blue line and the reward system shown in red. So because prefrontal systems involved in cognitive control take longer to mature compared to reward regions, this makes adolescents more likely to engage in risky behaviors, such as those listed here. So for example, acting on impulse and misreading or misinterpreting social and emotional cues. It also makes adolescents less likely to make well thought out and planned decisions. And of course, not all adolescents engage in delinquent behavior. This is actually another line of my research, kind of thinking about, what makes certain individuals risky and what is kind of a protective factor for teens. But we do see a heightened propensity for risk-taking and reward-seeking on average in this group compared to other ages. So now that I provided a brief overview of aspects of adolescent development that make teens vulnerable to risky behaviors like substance use, I'd like to review some recent trends in substance use in teens in the US. So this graph shows data from the 2022 Monitoring the Future survey results on past year alcohol use among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. So Monitoring the Future has been providing data since the mid-1970s on annual rates of substance use by age group and type. This data is nationwide, it's survey data, but the Monitoring the Future study is based out of the Institute for Social Research here at Michigan. And I worked quite a bit with this study and data while I was a doctoral student at Michigan. It's funded by NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse. And if you Google like Monitoring the Future, all of the information and the stats from that study is available online. So there's a lot of great resources and they're very easy to understand the way that they're presented. So as you can see here, over half of high school seniors reported past year alcohol use, making alcohol the most commonly used substance among teens. So binge drinking, which is a type of heavy drinking in a short time frame, is also fairly common among adolescents, more so in young adults, but we do see it occurring in adolescents. And binge drinking is typically defined as 4 or more drinks for women and 5 or more drinks for men in a row, with typically within like a 2-hour time frame. Binge drinkings are likely underreported, though, considering that many people, including adults, don't really understand what a standard drink is, which you can see here in the bottom left figure. So although binge drinking is still problematic in teens, the good news is that rates of binge drinking in this age group have been decreasing in recent years. And vaping nicotine is also a commonly used substance in teenagers, with over a quarter of high school seniors reporting any past year use. And data from the 2022 National Youth Tobacco Survey found that among current adolescent e-cigarette users, so those that were already using, more than a quarter use these products daily, and flavored products are much more preferred in this age group. You may have seen in the news, there's been some work being done to try to limit the sale of flavored tobacco products because they are so popular in youth. So the problem here is when, the teens, when they are using, they're using very frequently. So it can be more toxic to them in the daily use in particular. And rates of cannabis use are lower for 8th graders compared to vaping nicotine, but these numbers are about the same by 10th grade. And then by 12th grade, cannabis use is more common than vaping. Again, this is data from Monitoring the Future. So there's been a recent rise in cannabis use among youth, with perceptions of harm generally decreasing and legalization rising at the state level. In most of my talk today, I'll be using the word cannabis, but it is the same as marijuana. There has been a shift to use the word cannabis because marijuana can have more like negative connotations in like the Latinx community, and that it's, coming from Mexico, but cannabis is a little bit more general. And so that's the phrase, the word I'll be using today. And I'd like to point out that one big issue in measuring cannabis use and researching this drug is that both the mechanisms of use, which is shown on the left, and forms of marijuana use, shown on the right, vary widely. And these different types of use also have an impact on the intensity of high and associated harms. Some products may be more preferable among younger individuals, such as edible products. If you think about gummies, sweets, like cookies or brownies, and these products are typically highly potent, which adds to the problem here. And highly potent cannabis products are problematic for teens in particular because high levels of THC, so that's the psychoactive component in marijuana, may increase risk for experiencing the first symptoms of cannabis use disorder. So my colleagues recently completed a study finding this in cannabis when measured from 1994 to 2012. And since 2012, we know that rates of THC in cannabis are continuing to rise. So these are cannabis samples that have been seized by the DEA. So the cannabis adolescents are using is not the same cannabis that their parents may have used. So this is important to think about historical context and how substances are changing across time and how that impacts use behavior. So now shifting gears a bit to opioid use. So according to the Monitoring the Future survey, rates of opioid use among adolescents are low. But we see that rates of opioid use disorder have increased in recent years among adolescents and young adults. And deaths attributable to opioid use have also increased fairly dramatically among youth. And these deaths are driven predominantly by misuse of prescription fentanyl. This figure shows the substantial increase in pediatric deaths in the US caused by fentanyl, shown in red, compared to other opioids, which are shown in blue. And since rates of adolescent opioid use are typically so low, it hasn't really been on the radar for many substance use researchers, myself included. But as this graph shows, fentanyl use is emerging as a public health concern, not only in adults, but also in younger individuals. And here's another graphic on fentanyl compared to the other opioid use. So in the left figure, you can see a further breakdown of overdose mortality among adolescents 14 and 19 by substance type. And then on the right, you can see the breakdown of overdose deaths by race and ethnicity. And the highest rates are among American Indian and Alaska Native adolescents, followed by Latinx adolescents. So these trends do align with wider patterns of racial and ethnic inequalities and overdoses that warrant additional research and interventional efforts. So now that we know a little bit more about what substances adolescents are using, I'd like to review a summary of research on why adolescents are using those substances. In terms of psychosocial reasons for adolescent substance use, teens use to fit in socially. So for example, peer pressure to use or to be viewed favorably by peers. To feel good. So in other words, to experience the psychoactive effects, the high of that substance. To do better. So to improve performance. An example here is using non-prescription Adderall to stay up studying. And to feel better, meaning to cope with feelings of depression and anxiety. Regarding this last reason, I want to point out that substance use and mental illness often co-occur. You can see in this figure the adolescents who experience a past year major depressive episode. So that is in the darker, kind of the teal color blue. They had significantly greater levels of substance use across all substance types compared to adolescents who did not experience an MDE. When we think about risk factors for substance use, I really like the social ecological models. And so these situate the individual within more proximal to distal contexts. So the individual is nested within these other contexts. And it's helpful to organize the many different influences on behaviors such as substance use. This model here is shown to describe the different levels of both risk and protective factors for cannabis use, but they're also relevant to other types of substance use. From a resiliency perspective, it's important to consider both protective and risk factors. So hopefully we can build up the protective factors and decrease those risk factors. So at the individual level, protective factors include higher levels of self-efficacy and peer disapproval of substances. Risk factors include high levels of externalizing behavior, in other words, acting out, or delinquency, aggressive behavior, and interactions with peers who use that substance. Family level protective factors include a positive parent-child relationship and parental rules and monitoring. Examples of family level risk factors are parental acceptance of substances, family conflict. Also, parents' use of substances is a strong risk factor for own use of drugs and alcohol. One area of my research has been to use data from the Michigan longitudinal study, which is comprised predominantly of families who have parental substance use disorder, in particular alcohol use, but there are rates of other substance use as well, to understand psychosocial and neural risk and protective mechanisms underlying substance use. I'll talk a little bit more about this study later in my talk. As you can see here in this figure, over 10% of youth aged 17 and younger in the US live with a parent who has an alcohol use disorder. And there are several aspects of genetics and environment that make youth with a family history of substance use vulnerable to misusing substances themselves. Genetics accounts for about 40 to 60% of the risk, but also youth with parental substance use problems are elevated risk of being exposed to substances at an early age, be involved with deviant peers, and experience less parental monitoring. And beyond the family context are community level factors. Protective factors include school connectedness and involvement, and example community level risk factors are drug-related policy enforcement and absenteeism. And then when we get even further back, for more distal, risk factors in this domain are availability of substances in the surrounding community, exposure to drug-related marketing, and products marketed to youth. For the last two examples would be, if you think about all these new cannabis-related billboards in the area, fruit-flavored vaping products marketed toward teens as well. Well, all these levels of risk factors are really important to consider in terms of adolescent substance use behavior. My area of research is on specifically on brain function. So the next few slides are going to highlight some of the work my colleagues and I have done related to this particular focal area. In one recent study, we examined aspects of reward functioning in the brain linked to substance use in youth. This was a sample from the Michigan longitudinal study, which, as I mentioned before, is comprised predominantly of youth with parental substance use disorder. For this study, we examined brain function before they started using substances to see if there were aspects of early brain indicators for later substance use risk. The task we use for the study is called the monetary incentive delay task. This task measures neural correlates of reward responding. In this figure, you can see the different conditions of the task. Participants can either win or lose money, or there's no money at stake. And participants are asked to respond through a button press while they're in the scanner. And they respond when they see the black figure corresponding, the cue corresponding to the different condition. And so if they respond quickly enough, then they will either win, not lose, or there's no money at stake. And then they find out the feedback of their performance. So basically, they just want to hit it when they see that cue, and if they're too slow or too fast, then they don't get the money, or they for this task. And when I mention a scanner, it's a functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, which is a non-invasive way to measure changes in blood flow associated with brain activity in certain regions or networks of the brain. And you can see an example of what an fMRI machine looks like here. Our key findings were that even after accounting for externalizing behavior and family history of substance use disorder, greater activity in the nucleus accumbens, which is a central region within the brain's reward circuitry, during the anticipation of monetary rewards, predicted early substance use initiation, in this case by age 16. So the implications of this work are that heightened reward responding measured in early adolescence when youth are substance naive may be a possible early indicator of later substance use vulnerability. And reward functioning in the brain is important to study in terms of substance use risk because rewarding stimuli like drugs of abuse cause an influx of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter involved in the feelings of pleasure and also learning and mood. It's naturally occurring, but drugs of abuse cause an unnatural surge of dopamine in the brain. And it's important to point out that dopamine is involved actually in wanting rather than liking. There's been a group at Michigan that did kind of the seminal work showing this, that it's not necessarily the people even like when they're using it, but they just have this compulsive wanting caused by this dopamine influx. And this makes it relevant to addiction by teaching the brain to seek out drugs at the expense of other goals. In another study of youth from the Michigan longitudinal study, we looked at differences in resting state functional connectivity between youth that were not using substances and those that started using substances in the early age. And all of these youth had at least one parent with a substance use disorder diagnosis. Based on their use behavior, we categorize these youth as either resilient or high risk. As you can see here, resting state brain scans use fMRI to measure the brain at rest. We just ask participants to lie still in the scanner and focus on a crosshair image. Key findings from this work show that resilient youth, those that had a family history of substance use disorder but did not engage in early substance use themselves, had stronger synchrony between brain regions involved in self-control, including those areas related to flexible adaptation of thoughts and behaviors. The implications of this work are that youth with parental substance use disorder may benefit from prevention and intervention programs that strengthen self-control. This is an example of a study that went beyond just categorizing risk, but also looked at protective factors against substance use. I'd also like to talk about some new work I'm doing using real-time fMRI neurofeedback to assess developmental differences in reward responding and substance use risk. Real-time fMRI neurofeedback is a non-invasive, flexible tool for measuring modulation of brain function. As you can see here, it's basically a closed-loop system in which participants are trained to exert volitional control over brain activity in certain regions or networks, while viewing a dynamic feedback image to that activity. They're typically looking at a thermometer that goes up and down that's linked to their brain activity, and they're taught different strategies to be able to do that. And so it really helps people gain self-efficacy over their brain activity and to learn how to link their thoughts with their brain activity. And this type of training can help researchers learn more about the relationship between the mind and brain and offer clinicians novel treatment options for certain psychiatric and neurological diseases. It's been used a lot for people with depression, anxiety, OCD, ADHD, and addiction, just to name a few. So for my study called the Neuromod study, which is funded by the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, we've scanned approximately 130 adolescents and young adults with the groups about evenly split. These participants learned how to up and down regulate brain activity in the nucleus accumbens, which I described before as an important area in the brain's reward network. You can see in the lower figure the design of the task. So they're both increased, which is shown in the blue, and decreased trials shown in the yellow within 4 runs, so like 4 parts of the task, where we looked at the extent to which participants could increase and decrease their nucleus accumbens activity and if neurofeedback improved that ability. Before they went in the scanner, we asked them to think of different rewarding things to them, and it doesn't really matter what it is, it's just to train them so that we can see like the extent to they can up and down regulate. And I will note that this is a healthy sample, so they were not substance users because it's a fairly novel paradigm, and we just wanted to start out, with more of a baseline healthy sample that may not have impacts on their brain function because of heavier substance use. But eventually I would like to look at this in a substance using sample. So we found that although adolescents could modulate their nucleus accumbens activity, young adults were better at doing so. And this supports the dual systems model of brain development in terms of deficits in adolescents' abilities to exert top-down self-control over reward functioning due to that developmental mismatch I showed you in those 2 key brain regions. We've also found developmental differences in neurofeedback-related connectivity between the nucleus accumbens and regions involved in incentive processing. And in the adolescent group, we have been tracking their substance use every 6 months. So now that much of that data has been collected, we'll begin looking at associations between the ability to self-regulate reward and substance use initiation and escalation. All right, so now I'm going to discuss consequences of adolescent substance use, focusing on effects on the brain. So before we talked about what are things that may contribute to risk, and now what are those effects on, in particular, on the brain? Drugs of abuse affect the way neurons send, receive, and also process neurotransmitters. By mimicking the chemical structure of natural occurring transmitters, certain drugs like cannabis and heroin send abnormal messages through brain networks. And the endocannabinoid system in the human body encompasses a wide range of areas. It's very widespread. Other drugs like amphetamine and cocaine cause a large influx of neurotransmitters that interfere with transporters. And there are 3 key brain areas impacted by drug use. The first, which I've talked a lot about, and as you can tell is something I've done a lot of research on, is the reward circuit. This circuit, including the basal ganglia and also the nucleus accumbens, is overactivated by drugs, and repeated exposure to drugs of abuse diminishes pleasure from naturally occurring rewards. The emotional circuit, including the amygdala, is associated with the use of drugs in a self-medicating way, so to relieve distressing feelings. And because of this, it can lead to addiction through a cycle of withdrawal, use, withdrawal, and use.
Dr. Martz, we have a question.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The question is, do you think there has been an increasing with youth and suicidal thoughts and or attempts with reported substance usage or positive UDS? I work in an emergency room setting, and there has been an increase in adolescents, teens being seen for this.
So they were substance users who also had thoughts of suicide?
Feel free to add more to the chat, or just unmute, or if you'd like.
Yes, they're coming in hot. Yeah, they're coming into the emergency room, and they're also sometimes they come in for an attempt either self-harm behaviors, and later during the assessment process, it's been determined that they also have been used in different types of substances as well too, and they've had a history of it. So I'm just trying to get a feel, is that something that's happened across the board or not?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak specifically to that, but as I showed in the prior slide, there's really a strong association between substance use and mental health, mental illness. So there is, if there is someone that has depression or anxiety, they have greater odds of using substances. And it's tricky because substance use can be used to alleviate those symptoms of depression and anxiety, but then it can also amplify it, and so that is possible why we might be seeing that. It's this cycle of that, people thinking it's helping, but it's not. It's actually making those symptoms worse, which could lead to further problems.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
There's another question as well.
Yeah.
Also link between cannabis, marijuana use and psychosis, schizophrenia, like presentation.
Yeah. So, that we see that usually a little bit older, like in young adults. But there is research showing that, especially for people that have a family history of schizophrenia, that using marijuana might cause an earlier onset of symptoms. So there is a body of research out there showing linkages between experience of psychosis and earlier symptoms of, or earlier display, presentation of schizophrenia. Okay, so I'm gonna, so going back to these key brain regions here. So cognitive control circuit. So this is involved in thinking, planning, problem solving, and also the last part of the brain to mature, making adolescents most vulnerable. And opioids in particular impact the brainstem, which is associated with vital functions like breathing and heart rate, and also reduce the intensity of pain and sensitivity of emotions. And regarding neurotoxic effects of heavy substance use, adolescents and young adults are often less likely to experience more immediate perceived consequences like hangovers, which leads to greater consumption and more damaging effects on the brain. And this is especially problematic for if you're thinking of those brain regions involved in higher order thinking and self-regulation. So in this study, we looked at how different levels of adolescent substance use might impact later brain function related to both inhibitory control. So that's like self-control, the ability to like withhold your response, your responding in reward. Again, this was with the Michigan longitudinal study sample. So I already talked about the monetary incentive delay task and why we use it, but the go, no go task is, so basically for this task, they're in the scanner and they're pressing a button and they have to respond when they see a letter except for X. It's actually harder to do than you think. So you respond and they come at you pretty quickly. So this measures their ability to inhibit a prepotent response as an indicator of inhibitory control. And so we looked at their performance on both of these tasks at the same time, in the same kind of model. And we found discrete subgroups in our sample based on their pattern of brain activation. And so when we looked at prior rates of substance use in this, in this sample, we saw that the subgroup or class 2 had the lowest rates of use, while class 4 had the highest rates. So you can see that the low prior use group showed the lowest levels of reward responding. So this is in the little dotted line at the very bottom. Interestingly, both of these groups had comparable levels of brain activation associated with cognitive control, inhibitory control. So these findings suggest that those with higher rates of prior substance use might have to work harder in a way to perform at the same level as low prior users. And when we looked at both of these groups on their reaction time and other behavioral metrics, they didn't differ significantly. So this is kind of a reason why it's important to look at brain imaging, because you might be tapping into something that is not just can tell us, if with like paper and pencil assessments or even looking at reaction time. And so this group might, their activation might represent a compensatory activation. In another study, we wanted to see if certain aspects of brain function led to later substance use, or if substance use had an impact on brain function. In this case, we focused on cannabis use. So there's been a lot of talk about, certain aspects of brain function lead to this, or does then the substance use kind of change your brain in a certain way? So we did this kind of modeling where it basically looked at marijuana use and also brain activation and nucleus accumbens in parallel. And we looked at 3 separate time points in young adulthood. So this is young adulthood, but we did look at substance use in adolescence. And we found a greater extent of cannabis use was associated with lower levels of nucleus accumbens activation over time. So this finding held even after accounting for sex, parental history of substance use disorder, frequency of binge drinking and cigarette use, and prior levels of other use. This finding suggests that continued cannabis use might dampen the brain's natural abilities and reward responding. And in turn, this might contribute to addiction vulnerability. And there have been a few other studies that have replicated these findings in separate studies, so that it does seem like there might be something unique about cannabis that is lowering the brain's natural response to reward. Okay. But I've talked a bit about risk factors for adolescent substance use and effects on adolescent substance use, effects on the brain and in particular. One issue in this area of research is understanding the extent to which prior vulnerabilities and aspects of brain function make certain teens vulnerable to substance use, or if it's substance use changing the brain, as I mentioned. So thinking about which came first, the chicken or the egg. And to address this question, it's important to start studying teens before they use substances, and then also important to follow them over time. And this is what led to the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which started in 2015. It's also called the ABCD study. And it's been following over 11,000 kids across 21 sites in the US. As you can see in this map, Michigan is one of the study sites. And they selected these sites to try to have a representation of the US population. And they have done a fairly good job of doing that. In terms of race, ethnicity, and income, although the income levels are a little bit higher than what we see in the typical population. And so this, in addition to studying the brain, an array of other measures are being collected in areas such as social functioning and mental and physical health. You can see here the youth partake in a wide range of assessments, and also the parents complete their own assessments about the family and their child. So these kids come in, and it's almost pretty much a full day every other year, and then they do shorter assessments in the off years. In the every other year, they're due the imaging, brain imaging data. And there's also 6-month assessments done to collect data on behaviors like substance use in order to better catch when initiation begins. And if you go to like Google Scholar, things like that, and if you type in ABCD study and an area of interest related to adolescence, there's probably something published on it. There's been some really, really amazing work coming out already. Also, the ABCD study website has some really great resources available too for practitioners and families. So I would definitely check this out if you are interested in adolescent health and substance use. But it's not just focused on substance use. That was the original focus, but it covers a lot of things now. And as part of the substance use work group in the ABCD study consortium, we've done some studies on the baseline and early follow-up assessments. For this particular study, we looked at individual, peer, and parent level substance use, thinking back to the kind of the social ecological model of the person nested in these larger contexts. And we did this when they were pre-adolescent. So this is using the baseline data. Even though very few individuals had begun any substance use experimentation at this age, we did still ask these youth about their perceptions and thoughts about substance use. We also asked their parents if they had made rules about substance use and the availability of substances in their home. Also, peer use is another thing we ask about, or perceptions of friends using. And that's important because a lot of kids overestimate the number of people that use drugs and alcohol. And way back to the beginning slides, there are a decent number of individuals using, but the majority of youth are actually not using substances. And that's a common misperception in youth. So in this study, we found that about 10% of the sample reported being curious about using alcohol and nicotine, and 3% reported curiosity to use cannabis. And again, these are only 9 and 10-year-olds. Youth with greater perceived peer use reported significantly higher odds of having curiosity to use themselves. And youth with parents who reported easier access to substances in the home had a greater likelihood of having curiosity to use. We also found that few parents had made rules about not using substances. Likely this is because they thought their children were too young to be using, and maybe they wanted to avoid an awkward conversation and were putting it off a bit. But our results show that youth do know about drugs of abuse at this age, at least the common ones like alcohol and nicotine and cannabis or marijuana. And some are beginning to show curiosity to use. In other work we've done looking at patterns of substance use in 3 follow-up waves of data from the ABCD study, we found that rates of use are still relatively low in the sample. So this looks like a lot here in this figure, but if you look on the left side, the percent is only a little over 2%. But when we have 11,000 kids, that's a nice thing about such a large study. It can allow us to look at these maybe like very high risk subgroups that we might want to focus on, for intervention work. And these measurements reflect full use, so a full drink rather than just a sip. So the rates are a little bit higher for experimental use, but this is so full drink of alcohol, full use of a nicotine product, and a full use of a cannabis product. Another thing I want to point out is that there are fairly large jumps in use rates over time, and it's going to be really interesting to see how rates continue to change as data continues to be collected. Other work we've done with ABCD study data has looked to see if some of our previous results from the Michigan longitudinal study are replicated in a larger, more diverse sample. The Michigan longitudinal study is predominantly male and predominantly white. Interestingly, when the study started, I believe in the 70s, maybe early 80s, the National Institutes of Health was saying, well, why would you look at girls? Like, boys are the only ones that use substances. We know that's not true. And so girls started, we did start including female siblings as well. But anyway, we wanted to look at this more in the widespread sample of ABCD. In this study, we looked at reward responding and the nucleus accumbens among early adolescents with parental alcohol use disorder from both studies. So the Michigan longitudinal study is predominantly consists of having that family history, but there are about I believe about 17% of the ABC study sample that have any parental substance use as well. And there's a body of literature showing that density of family history of substance use problems, so having more family members with problems, is more detrimental to children. And reward-related brain function may play a role in this vulnerability. Across both of these studies, we found that having 2 versus 1 parents with alcohol use disorder in particular was associated with blunted or reduced reward responding. So this brain response may indicate an early indicator of reward dysfunction underlying substance use risk. It also shows that there's a lot of nuance in terms of family experiences of substance use problems that may affect vulnerability. Okay, so in sum, adolescence is a developmental period when substance use is most likely to begin. Although alcohol, nicotine, and cannabis are the most widely used in teens, fentanyl is emerging as a public health concern in this age group. Many different factors across many different levels of influence underlie substance use vulnerability. And neural risk factors associated with adolescent substance use include things like deficits in inhibitory control and reward responding. And substance use has a detrimental impact on multiple areas of the adolescent brain. So there is a lot still, to research in this area. There's a lot of complexity, especially as we think about the course of adolescence, and there's so many minute changes happening during this time that influence behaviors in development, and those are all important to consider. All right, so that concludes my talk, and I'd be happy to open it up to any questions individuals have. I guess either through the chat, or if you want to, I don't know how you want to, maybe like,
Yeah, we do have one
function or what you normally do.
Yeah, we do have one right now. It says, does having a non-blunted reward response make substance use less pleasant?
I think what that's trying to get at is if you already have like more like a heightened natural reward sense. I think that in line with some of the research I presented, that you may kind of, get that, think of like natural highs, like, from exercise, or like being around people you enjoy, doing activities you like to do, those kind of things. If you can kind of get that from more natural experiences, then there is some thought that you may not rely so much on kind of external things to boost that reward.
I was one who asked that
Yeah.
question. I guess what I was thinking of, say, in college,
Mhm.
friends saying how they loved being drunk. Personally, I have always hated being drunk. I find it boring. It's not rewarding. I also didn't do a lot of stuff when I was younger. So I was wondering if you have, like, say, more not your neurodevelopment's less interfered with. So when you're older and you start using, it's not a reward anymore. It's kind of a, that's too much. It's too bright. It's too loud. It's almost that when you're older, you're less likely to start abusing substances because you don't have your reward system actually makes it almost in a way like, turning the lights on when your eyes are dark adapted. It's just not nice, not enjoyable.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that gets into your subjective response to the substance. For example, some people, like, even though alcohol is a depressant, some people will subjectively feel a lot more up and like ready to party and excitable because of alcohol, especially when they first start using. Then the more you use, more of the depressive affect experience it has, while others might use once and they feel tired, for example. They don't have that subjective response. So kind of the way that you respond to alcohol can play into that, whether you continue to use. I see one comment here about hearing about like meth, cocaine, and heroin. It's just rates are so low in adolescence. That's not to say that there aren't any adolescents using it, but we typically see those use of those substances starting in young adulthood. And that's where I would recommend looking at the monitoring the future data. They have data separated out by adolescents and then adults, and they follow the adults up to age, last I checked, 55. It might even be up to 60 now. So they're starting to look into, wider into adulthood, where they do show those substances that are more commonly used in older age groups.
The next one after that was, are there research showing decreased use when parents do have rules and guidelines about substances? And then it says wishful thinking.
Yeah, there actually is support for that, that if parents have rules and guidelines, and as I presented earlier, the better. A lot of the work done at schools, like when I was younger, we had Just Say No. I think DARE is pretty common too. And the research on those programs has shown that they're wildly ineffective. If anything, they might like teach kids about new drugs. And so those programs are very ineffective, but the more, the parent's role is important. I mean, there's a lot of factors. You can still be a great parent and, your kid might, experience these problems, but in general, parents that do have parental monitoring is a huge protective factor. Setting those rules and expectations is protective as well. Interestingly, research has shown that that sharing your experiences with alcohol or drugs, like, oh, and I did this and it was, that is not really helpful. So disclosing what happened to you and how that affected you isn't helpful for teens, but having those rules and setting them early on can be protective.
Thank you. Dr. Marks, we had some questions, I think, that got lost up in the
Oh, yeah.
chat. One was, is there any research showing decreased use when parents do have rules/guidelines about substances? Oh, Megan, you just read it. Sorry. The next one was, any thoughts on poly drug use and risk among adolescents? Have heard people say with substance use disorders, say it is a disease of more.
Yeah. Poly drug use. So that is, using a lot of different substances it's really relevant to adolescents, especially because that's when experimental use is occurring. As you get older, it seems like more people kind of pick their poison. Not everyone, but especially I've noticed with like cannabis use, there's quite a few cannabis users that will say like, I only use substances, alcohol is awful, only use the, cannabis. But early on, especially with adolescents, there's more kind of dabbling in different things. And yeah, I haven't done a lot of research on that, but there is research on it showing like, for example, like cannabis and alcohol use. And I think they've been calling them like greenouts. It's kind of like blackouts, like with alcohol, but with cannabis. And there might be like a higher likelihood of experiencing that when you're using cannabis. It's also important to think about the, is one drug a depressant where one is a stimulant? I even like caffeine and alcohol. So when I was working on monitoring the future data, I did some work looking at risk taking and alcohol and caffeine use. And we found that, and it kind of relates to this idea of, for example, like drinking and driving, like, well, if I have like Red Bull vodka, or like if I have an energy drink with my alcohol, I feel more aware. But in like driving simulation tests they've done, the people that had the alcohol versus alcohol plus energy drinks still performed at the same level. So yeah, there's a lot of nuance. And I think researchers need to do more to understand that in terms of co-use. And are people using one at one time and the other at another time? Or are they using it at the same time? Yeah, there's a lot of complexity to that. And I think some of it does relate to generally like propensity for risk taking. Like you don't care what it is, you just want to have that high, that sense of reward. If you're high sensation seeking, it may not necessarily matter what type of substance you're using.
Thanks. That kind of feeds us into the next question. With the shown rise of fentanyl use, are these accidental fentanyl usages from laced other substances, or are these kids shown to be actively seeking fentanyl? With the strength of fentanyl versus other substances, is the impact of fentanyl specifically having even more detrimental effects on the brain in adolescents going forward into adulthood?
Yeah, my understanding is that typically it is laced with other substances, and they're not, or they might not realize the potency of the fentanyl. What else is included? There's, if they're on the street, they may not, they may mix with other things. So that does contribute to likelihood of overdose. Opioid use in teens is not really my focal area, but the strength. Yeah, I think with more acute effects though of fentanyl is more on the respiratory effects. I think, with the influences on reward and brain functioning, you might see that with more continued use, but in the acute, it's more of the brain stem linkages to heart and respiratory problems.
Great, thanks. We do have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go ahead and share some of our other information that we had at the beginning of our presentation today as Dr. Marks continues to answer some of our questions, and we'll just keep plowing through them. And so I'll switch screens. The next question while I'm doing that is, please remind us of the findings related to using the fMRI to train for self-control.
So this is a study I've been working on for the last few years, and we've actually gotten some momentum with other researchers and clinicians wanting to use this technique. And I just went to a conference at Yale. There's a lot more people doing real-time fMRI. So I think there's a lot of potential here. I didn't go into too many details. I could give like a whole separate talk on this, but basically we found that so I was thinking about, how does this link to what we know about adolescent brain development? And it does, and understand that those are more of like theoretical models, but they don't really test it in the same, in like one fell swoop. And so by doing this, we can really see like that top-down control over reward functioning. And as we thought, that adolescents are struggling more to exert that top-down control. You can see them when they're in the scanner. There's actually what we call like the online data, where you can see their activation pattern going up and down while they're in there, which is pretty neat. And that's what's linked to the thermometer. So this image here shows a ball, that red ball, and that's what we're having them increase and decrease while they're in the scanner by thinking of rewarding and not rewarding things. But yeah, we are looking at how that maps onto those that are using substances, with the thought there that those that are less able to self-regulate their reward responding would be more likely to start using substances as we follow them over the course of time.
Great, thanks. There's a few more in there. If we're kind of down to the bottom, if you can see those.
Okay. Yeah, so I was at a conference a few weeks ago about the importance of getting research out to the community. Someone was asking about version, for like parents and community town halls. And if anyone knows of any opportunities for that in your communities, I'm always looking for opportunities for myself, for other colleagues to give talks, and we can like frame it, on certain drugs, or like make it a little more digestible for certain audiences. And NIDA, so National Institute on Drug Abuse, and also the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, they do have, if you go to their websites, those are both through National Institutes of Health, they have different tabs for parents and for teens and for educators, and there's a lot of great resources on there. And actually NIAAA, so that's the alcohol group, they created this virtual reality video where you can like look at what happens to your brain when you use alcohol. And I think there's a video, like a YouTube video too, where it's not as fun if you had, the VR goggles, but there are some great resources there to check out as well.
And we'll do our last one.
Go
ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry. We are still recruiting. I did see there was someone who would be interested. We're recruiting 25 to 27-year-olds. And for our study, and 14 to 16-year-olds still recruiting if they are interested in that. And you can email me to get more information about that. I'll put that in there real quick. Someone did ask about that. So.
And then we'll do our last few questions here. I know, just to be conscious of everyone's time, we will be hanging out for a minute to do some admin tasks with Zoom. And so we'll be here for another few minutes. But it states when problematic use leads to the need for residential treatment. Are you able to see that question? It's how much does the less developed adolescent brain and impulsivity impact the pace of treatment? Do you see that one scrolled up just a tad bit from the bottom? Okay.
I think that's really important. Even like it's tricky. I mean, there's some people that work with like in the judicial system of culpability in teenagers. I think they do have the capacity to make informed decisions and exert self-control, but it is a lot weaker than in adults. And I think being aware of that is important, and what they're capable to do. And I think people, use of things like real-time fMRI, like we can train them to maybe strengthen that a little bit, but their baseline is at a point that is different than adults and young adults. And so thinking about where they're at, in clinical work, we say a lot of meet the patient with where they're at. And I think we need to think about that with teenagers, of where they're at right now in terms of their brain development and how that might impact their treatment.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone so much for spending this last hour with us, the Michigan Opioid Collaborative, and with Dr. Martz. Thank you so much for your expertise and sharing your time with us as well. Again, all of the slide deck will be sent out to everyone from their local behavior health consultant through the Michigan Opioid Collaborative. And so as long as you've signed with your name, your email, and your location into the chat, we'll make sure that all that information is correct and updated. And we will be sending out these slides. Again, you should be seeing the screen with the QR code and some other information needed for CEs today. It does expire, so we ask that you go ahead and just jump on that. But we'll send that out via an email as well. I know some folks might be joined via an iPad or a phone and not have access to that in the chat. So we will send that out in a email very shortly. But we hope everyone has a fantastic weekend. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Please check out our website, which is michiganopioidcollaborative.org, for all our other wonderful events in July. We have a great presentation next week on the Michigan Vulnerability Index. That's next Tuesday, and we would love to have everyone join us for that presentation as well. So again, thank you so much, and we'll hang around to tidy up some things. Otherwise, have a great weekend.